What did the fallen angels and the Nephilim really look like? Welcome, gentlemen.
It's a very, very old tradition regarding the Nephilim going back to ancient Sumer. From the earliest of times, we have this opposition in ancient Sumer between the eagle and the snake.
We can see this symbolism spreading through all cultures as well, even in India, right? We know that there's symbolism with the Garuda, right? The eagle and the conflict between that and the Nagas.
You have watchers of heaven and watchers of the earth.
We had the equivalent term, it was the Anunnaki.
These were powerful, perfect warriors, and 2 to 1 was the average for the width-to-height ratio. I have multiple accounts, including the Ugaritic text, including Akkadian accounts, and a Sumerian translation that has 11 cubits for Gilgamesh.
That's not correct. The best authoritative text definitely is 7.
I'm telling you, the translations I have say that.
The greatest man of renown in the ancient world was surely Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh as an antediluvian 11 cubit size, that's just over 19 feet.
We do read that Och, the king of Basan, in the land of the giants, we read that his bed was 9 cubits.
Offspring would look just like them in the beginning, probably all before the flood.
Could it be that some of these fallen angels, this specific groups, that they look more serpent-like? What would you guys say?
You have this imagery of Akhenaten that's over 1,000 years after the flood. And if you look at that statue, you're seeing a serpentine face.
When I look at the depictions like the orcs from Warcraft or the Egyptian gods with glowing eyes and in Stargate, the series, I wonder, could the Nephilim have resembled these beings, and what did the first family lines of Nephilim really look like? Did the fallen angels take human form, or could some have appeared as their true angelic selves while interacting with humans? Doesn't the Bible say that angels cannot have offspring? Have you ever wondered about this? What did the fallen angels and the Nephilim really look like? That is what we're going to talk about today, but I'm not going to talk about it alone. I brought in 2 experts, Gary Wayne and Dr. Willem McLoud. Welcome, gentlemen.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for having us.
It's good to have you here. I actually talked with both of them on the channel before. Some of you might be here for the very first time. And if that is the case, let me introduce them very quickly. Dr. McLoud spent decades focusing on ancient Middle Eastern studies. He has a PhD in nuclear physics, nuclear fusion, and 3 master's degrees. He also published a lot of work, including the Nephilim trilogy. Gary Wayne is a brilliant researcher and author who spent over 45 years researching biblical prophecy, history, and mythology, and so many other things. He's also the author of the Genesis 6 conspiracy books. Actually, I have their books right here. I'll add it for you guys in the video description down below. Please check them out. There's so much information here. And both of these gentlemen, they are unique. They have different ways of researching. And I think this video is going to be very, very interesting. So let's jump right into this. Let's start with the fallen angels. I've got a list here of questions that some of my subscribers asked, and I added a few of my own here as well. But the first question is focused on the fallen angels. Which group of fallen angels slept with human females, and what did they look like? Gary, I'm going to pass that to you to start us off. But I just want to thank you as well, because I know you're a little bit under the flu, but you still made the effort to be here. So thank you.
Well, yeah, I'd just love to be able to have an opportunity to talk about these things. And I think that question as an opening question is just a terrific question. And I think it's one that for people that are in the genre, it's on their tips of their tongues all of the time, because it seems to be a key to understanding things, but unlocking that door sometimes is a little bit difficult. So biblically in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, where we get the creation of the giants, we're told it's the sons of God. Now, I won't spend a lot of time making the case whether these are angels or humans. That's a different discussion. So for the sake of this discussion is that these are the sons of God. That would be in Job 38, 4 through 7, with the morning stars at the time of creation, where humans couldn't be. And we'll just sort of shortcut that aspect first. So Are there more than one kind of angel? And the answer is there's a lot of angels. There's a number of different ranks, a number of different orders. And the
Right.
sons of God doesn't seem to be at first glance to be a specific order. So is it saying all of the angels, or is it saying only certain ones? And what's even more mysterious is that in the accounting in Genesis 6, we're told that the sons of God went to human females and then again afterwards. And as you take that back to the Hebrew, in like manner. So does that mean in the second incursion after the flood and the third incursion after the flood, how many incursions? And does that also include an incursion before the flood after the first one? How many incursions are there? And so if that happens with multiple incursions, are there multiple orders? So let's start dealing with who the sons of God are. Typically, we understand this if we link in a little bit of apocrypha just for a frame of reference. We get a group called the Watchers that are talked about as being these sons of God in the book of Enoch. And first Enoch is what I'm referring to. And I understand it's not canon, but we do get the term Watchers in the Bible. We get it 4 times in the book of Daniel. And that
Yeah.
word watcher is the Hebrew word ayir, and it means to watch or a watcher angel. So we know this is a specific kind of angel. And in the account of Daniel, they come from the throne. They come with the power and authority of religious aspects and of governance. So these are very important angels. And so watchers are understood as ones who watch around the throne of God. Trouble is, there's more than one group of watchers. So you have in the group of watchers, you have archangels, and I know the standard hierarchy wouldn't place them around the throne of God, except that the descriptions in the Bible say they come from the presence of God, like Gabriel and Michael. So they would be part of the watcher group. You'll have seraphim, which are 6-winged, serpent-faced dragon angels, so to speak. You have cherubim, which have 4 different faces on them, one being a bull, one being a eagle or a bird, one being a lion, and one being a human face. And then there's an interesting group that's also there that is talked about in the book of Enoch again. And one of the reasons why we know at least the origination of Enoch came out of Hebrew is a term that's used for these throne angels called Ophanim. That's Ophanim, sometimes spelled with a double N in the middle there. And that we can get there biblically as to who these angels are through the book of Ezekiel 1, 3, and 10, where we have the vision of God's throne and the chariot given to Ezekiel, and we get the cherubs. Then we get these angels in the wheels of the concentric wheels. And the wheels is the Hebrew word gilgal, meaning wheel, or chariot wheel, and words associated with that. But the angels inside the wheel are a little bit distinct from the cherubim. One of the faces is a cherub, which makes no sense, sort of, as I understand it as a contrarian, because cherub has 4 faces. So is that a 4-faced cherub as one of the faces? And then the other faces are a man, a lion, and an eagle. So one different. So there's a distinction, and a distinction in the location and in the function. That's the Hebrew word ophan that is referring to these wheel angels. And these are the Ophanim that the book of Enoch is referencing. So another group of watchers, and all part of those 4 groups that are at the top. So are the watchers inclusive of all 4? Perhaps they are, and something that makes it a little bit more intriguing as we go into the understanding of who these watcher angels are. And the watchers may not be the only group. So we have other groups of angels. And so understanding the hierarchy and understanding, is there other information and data points that we could link to them in terms of, do we have some sort of evidence that they actually produced some giants? and these would be angels that we get mostly out of the Greek side of the New Testament. Not used, unfortunately, not consistently in the translation as to how they're going to be translated as powers and principalities and authorities. They don't translate consistently, which makes it difficult. But you have orders that are dunamis and kartachi. You have arche, and you have exousia, and you have Icarus, all different types of angels that are different than the messenger angels or the soldier angels, right? And so again, we're not told, did any of them produce giants both before and after the flood, or one or the other, or was there just one incursion and giants survived the flood? So all different types of questions. And if they did produce giants, how do spirit angels actually do that? So I'll leave it there. I just wanted to lay out that this is a complex topic, and that we do know the sons of God in Genesis 6:4, which could be used generically as well for angels, because they're all considered sons of God, or sons of Jesus, as he's described as the Word of God who created all things, and also in Colossians 1 created all of these different kinds of angels beneath them. And so it's something that we need to dig deeper in if we really want to understand how this world worked, how it works today, and what's going to happen in the end time.
Yeah. Whew, that's one way of opening this video. I think a lot of people have a lot of questions right now, and I know for the three of us, our heads are like, "Ooh, there's so much to talk about here." But I just want to calm down a lot of Christians as well. So all three of us, we're Christians. We believe in the Bible 100%, and we do know like the books of Enoch, the Apocrypha. Some of them we read because it's interesting, right? And there is some truth in it, but it's not God's inspired word. So we do understand that. But it is interesting to look at all these other sources and see how it connects with the Bible that might be able to fill in some blanks for us. Willem, do you have anything to add to what Gary said?
Yeah, so my own approach is to focus more on the extra biblical evidence for the Nephilim, and the apocalyptic, Jewish apocalyptic literature, like the Book of Enoch, falls in that category. But I'm also very interested in the more ancient kind of traditions going back to ancient Sumer. And in this regard, I think what is interesting is the Nephilim are only mentioned twice in the Bible. The one is in Genesis 6 and the other in Numbers 13. Now, in Genesis 6, you've mentioned that we read that it was the giants, or rather the Nephilim, were born when the sons of God saw the daughters of men. And then later on, verse 4, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them, those who were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So the sons of God, that's the major question. Who were the sons of God? Now, this is actually a very old term that had been taken over from very early biblical tradition, and we also find it in the Ugarit texts, where reference is made to the sons of El, which is El is often translated as God, especially in the book of Genesis. So the sons of El is a very old term, going back in very ancient times in Semitic circles. It just refers in general to what we would later on call the angels. And interestingly, the Septuagint, which was translated in the 3rd century BC, actually translates this verse with angels. And what is more also quite interesting is that even further back in ancient Sumer, we had an equivalent term. It was the Anunnaki. Now, Anunnaki just means the seed of Nun, or the sons of Nun. Now, Nun means prince. And the earliest form of this name referred to An, which was the supreme god, the exact equivalent of El. And his name, the name An, can be translated as the Most High, which is also a term that we later on find in the Bible, and also actually in at Ugarit, El Elyon, the Most High God. And now later on, it's interesting that the term could also be interpreted as Anunnaki, meaning the seed of the princess, so the high gods in that sense. Later on, the term Nin was often applied to Enki, which was an opponent of An in that ancient period, and that introduced the story of the fall, fallen angels, all of that. But in my view, this refers then to angelic beings long before they were called angels, as we find in the Bible. In the ancient world, they were called gods, and more generally, and the sons of God was one of those terms used for them, and the fallen gods were then the one that were involved here in this event or events, and this we can derive from the terminology Nephilim, meaning fallen, the fallen ones. So this is the way that I understand it. It's a very, very old tradition regarding the Nephilim and the Anunnaki, fallen Anunnaki, and so forth, going back to ancient Sumer. And so this is the way that I understand this particular passage.
Yeah, and good stuff. And those data points that we use outside the Bible should line up directionally with the Bible from a Christian perspective. From a non-Christian perspective, free to do what you want. But so that's what, for me, what a Christian does good research that sort of way. So I would sort of underline some of those data points that Willem was just talking about. And so when we look at that word watcher in Sumerian, you have an understanding that you have watchers of heaven and watchers of the earth. This is consistent with the Bible and consistent with what was just underscored, that Nephilim not technically are fallen ones, but carry that term from the source word Nephal, which means to fall, and put on the I am plural, and it's fallen ones. And that word Nephal is used in Isaiah 14 with Lucifer, or Satan, as I would prefer to call him. When he fell from heaven, that's the word Nephal. So put on the I am, you get the same sort of plural as in Nephil and Nephilim, or Rapha and Rephaim for other kinds of giants that we'll probably talk about a little bit later after the flood. So when we look at these are the sons of the fallen ones, they take on the same titles as their divine representatives. So they're not only called watchers of heaven, watchers of the earth. You can call them the Nephilim of heaven, and for the sons of God, and the Nephilim of the fallen ones, or the Nephilim of the earth for the Nephilim giants, titans of heaven in Greek mythology, titans of the earth. So Atlas, for example, was an offspring of, in the standard understanding with Poseidon, was the father, Clymene being the daughter, and he has, 9 other brothers as well, but he was called a hero and a titan, still a giant. And so you get this sort of consistency. And that word watcher in Sumerian is rooted in Agigi, and Agigi for eyes, as in to watch. And so you see how the words pass on. You get the same kind of meaning in Greek with a dragon associated word as drakonta and drakont, which means to watch or watchers. And so again, you get this consistency around the ancient world, or the Urshur watchers, and the Neter gods in Egypt were called, as they're defined, as watchers as well. So we get that consistency, but I liked what was raised as well, that Ugaritic text is probably, for me, the best ancient script to use as a parallel source, because it's ancient Semitic. You actually have the same words in the Ugaritic text as you do in the Bible. So when you get, the Ben El in the Ugaritic text, that's literally the same thing as Ben Ha Elohim, the sons of God, right? It's the same thing. And not to be confused with God Most High, as in El Elyon with the EL in the singular superlative, or Elohim in the singular application and superlative case. but El, the parent god of the Canaan pantheon, versus Baal, the offspring god, who also produces giants and likely produces those giants after the flood, according to the Ugaritic text. So we get a sort of a sense of certainty there and consistency that is talked about in all of the other polytheist accounts around the world, not just in those civilizations. It's a constant. It is a inexplicable constant that one should not just say, well, they all had the same hallucinating drugs that they used to produce the same stories. It makes absolutely no sense from a research kind of basis. So these are real people. They are the same word that Israel comes from. That is also translated as angels in the Septuagint in Deuteronomy 32. And so you have Israel is a two-part word. It is Sarah, meaning prince, that was also referenced, and El, so sons of the, and as it's used as sons of Israel. You can use that as the title given to Israel for a future reference, but also for information into the history where these council, the gods were going to rule over the 70 nations. These are the sons of the ruling god. So it can also mean ruling in Sarah or prince. So when you start to look at how you would translate that for consistency, you get multiple sources, just as the gods are talked about in Psalms 82 as the sons of the Most High. Same beings as referenced in Genesis 6 and Job 38 and Job 2:1 and 1:6. But now you're using El Elyon, so to speak, as opposed to Elohim in the superlative sense there. So it is the same reference to the same understanding that's recorded consistently. And it's absolutely amazing how Christianity and leaders in Christianity try and twist the Bible into pretzels to cover this up.
Whew, some good points here. And you mentioned Israel as well. And we read in the Bible that, God for us, he connects these dots because before Israel was even there, we read that Abraham's fathers, they worshiped other gods, right? But then it also explains that these are no gods, but fallen angels, right? But from that understanding from different cultures at that time, there were different gods, but El Elyon was the God most high. So we understand that. But it's interesting that you talked about the draconic, and the seraphim angels, what they looked like. And we read in the revelation of Satan himself being the dragon of old, right? And also when we read Genesis, I mean, there was the serpent that came. So some of these fallen angels could have these serpentine features, right? So could it be that some of these fallen angels, this specific groups, the fathers of these Nephilim, that they look more serpent-like? What would you guys say?
Yeah, this is quite an interesting observation. You see, in my view, there can be no doubt that the Bible evolved with ancient Middle Eastern contexts. So that's why the ancient world is so important for understanding the Bible. And Abram, according to the Bible, the city from which he originated was Ur in Sumer,
Right.
Ur of the Chaldeans.
So there we are, Mesopotamia. You travel all the way down here to the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. That is where Abraham went, all the way.
This is important because it tells us that the Sumerian or the ancient Mesopotamian tradition, because there were not only Sumerians living in ancient Mesopotamia, there were also Semites, and they were called the Akkadians. It's quite likely that Abram was actually an Akkadian. The name Abraham is attested to in Akkadian. So the Akkadians, the Semites, and the Sumerians shared the same land. So the tradition that we find in the Bible goes back to that ancient world, especially the traditions that we find in the primeval history. That's Genesis 1 to 11, of which Genesis chapter 6 is important. So the idea of snakes entering the picture is quite significant because from the earliest of times we have this opposition in ancient Sumer between the eagle and the snake. And that goes back to
Right.
traditions that I actually believe goes back to even before the deluge, antediluvian traditions. And the snake was closely related or connected with Enki. I've mentioned earlier that Enki stood in opposition to the god An, the Most High God, which was in turn closely associated with the Anzu eagle. So the snake definitely plays an important role since earliest of times, and at the city of the god Enki, which means the Lord of the earth or the Lord of the land, was Eridu, and we'll talk about that more later on. But what is important is the symbol of the snake was very important at Eridu. And we even find very old figurines of a woman with a serpent-like posture and face with a baby. I've seen also one of these in the Iraqi museum, which I visited at the end of last year in Baghdad,
Nice.
and quite interesting to observe. That goes back before the deluge, very, very old, to the Ubaid period. And it's consistent with the literature. We have, for example, texts which obviously dates much later. But for example, in the Keshim, we read about Ninhursag, which was the consort of Enki. And she
Yeah.
was actually shown with the lower body of a serpent. And she is described as this mother goddess, very similar to these early depictions of heroes in the temple. And the heroes in the temple, some of them are called Anunnaki, which is quite interesting in this hymn, which is actually the oldest, one of the most likely the oldest piece of literature, of one of the most ancient pieces of literature that we have in our possession. So the idea that the snake plays an important role and that there's some connection between the Nephilim and snake spirits, or the image, the symbol of the snake, I can go with that. I think that's quite possible, but the exact way that should be packaged, I think we will need a long discussion for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Gary, I would love you to respond on this. I just want
Yeah.
to throw in here as well that we can see this symbolism spreading through all cultures as well, even in India, right? I had some people from India comment and they say, well, Sumerian, no, that came after the Indus Valley. And there's a lot of discussion to have on that as well, right? But what is interesting is that we know that there's symbolism with the Garuda, right? The eagle and the conflict between that and the Nagas, right?
Exactly.
We can see there as
Mm.
well. But Gary, maybe you can respond on all of this.
Yeah. So, and there's a lot there. So again, one thing we want to understand is that there are loyal angels and there are disloyal angels. Hebrew El can be translated IL, can be transliterated AL, ILU, all different formats throughout the Middle East for the same types of beings. And that the types of angels that are at odds with each other are, in the macro sense, from the angelic rebellion against the loyal angels, right? So there would be certain orders that might be used to check the fallen angels, the ones sent by God, or you could have internal rivals. So it's an interesting thing as you start to dig into it. But starting with the basics of it, serpentine imagery is a common legacy throughout the world for the pantheon of gods that are worshipped.
Right.
And it's again an overlooked in most cases and dismissed if it is looked upon, because the recognition of it causes more questions and more research. So what do we mean by that? Well, there was a few things that were talked about. Yes, the giants and the gods were both depicted in Sumeria as serpentine or dragons. Not
Mm.
only the offspring gods like Enlil and Anki, but also the parent gods, like the most common one and famous one would be Tiamat and her consort Absu. These were serpentine imageries from the parent gods. These are the sons of heaven, the sons of An or sons of Anu, the chief god. You have not only the Nagas, which are serpentine dragon type of gods that are talked about in the subcontinent of India, but you have the sons of heaven, which are dragon creator gods and kings in China. And they have Tengu watcher gods as well, some of them having different faces, yes, which is again not inconsistent to what we've been talking about. But again, a constant there of this dragon serpentine imagery. You have in Central America through the Quiche Maya and other Central and South American countries and North American First Nations, you have, but staying focused on the most common ones that people would be aware of, you have a post-Diluvian serpentine god for the Mayans who is named Quetzalcoatl. He's a feathered serpent or a plume serpent. That's common. It's part of the worldwide history. When you get through the Middle East, you have gods like Baal and El and Osiris and his consort, which I won't use her name because it might bring it down in YouTube. So I'll be careful of that. But that particular mother goddess has other consistent Queen of Heaven names, both before and after the flood, just as Zeus and Kronos were originally depicted as serpentine. These are called Uraeus gods throughout the Middle East. And these are these serpents that are depicted with these wings. And they were not just animals, they were Uraeus gods. There were, and with the names associated with them out of these pantheons. And it was an absolute constant. And so if they somehow produced offspring, it would make sense that their offspring would carry characteristics of those celestial mafia godfathers, as I tongue-in-cheek like to call them. And that we also need to keep in mind, as you say, with the eagles. Eagles show up as translations in the Bible for angels. It doesn't tell us which rank and order, but I think we could probably get down to either the Ophanim or the cherubim, that they would choose one face when they took a form on the earth. And you also get the same type of eagle gods and bird gods that are in Southeast Asia. And they are literally part of the Tengu gods. And they produced offspring as well. But that's, again, a little bit of a different rabbit hole. So when we look at watchers, we have two other groups that are represented if they take a single face. So if you look at how cherubim are represented on the earth, you could look at a sphinx, which could have a human face or a lion's head and the body that's worshipped as in Egypt. That would be them taking one of those forms in this physical world. As you move into the east out of Egypt, you have cherubs that have a bull's face. And then you have ones that are kind of like gargoyle-like, which are more bird-like faces. And so you're going to see depictions of all four represented in the pantheon of gods, not as many, because the serpentine ones outnumber them, but there are different kinds of ones depicted in the various kinds of gods in each of the pantheons of parent gods before and after the flood. So as we look to the angels that have a watcher capability as a qualification for reproduction, we need to sort of maybe open our eyes a little bit more, that there's a few more to be considered in the larger picture. But the most common one would be the serpentine look, and that's both before and after the flood. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Sumeria, it doesn't matter whether you're in Ugarit. These kings are being depicted as seraphim type angels, serpent type angels. So when you roll that forward, let's say to how do we get something that we can actually get tangible on? You have this imagery of Akhenaten that's over 1,000 years after the flood. And if you look at that statue, you're seeing a serpentine face. You're seeing a long protruding chin, high cheekbones, large wraparound eyes that would light up a room because they were called shining ones as well. And this elongated skull. Some of the times he's shown with this big, goofy cone head hat to cover the cone head, so to speak. But nonetheless, there's depictions where you have these elongated, sutureless, featured skulls that are part of the Royale. So we have the seraphim look, and as this relates to Daniel 4, they're in charge of the governance, right? They're in charge of the religion, and that's why you have the gods populating the religious pantheon and representatives as offspring that would look just like them in the beginning, probably all before the flood, and then degrading over time after the flood. And then there's one other interesting sort of depiction that sort of links things together back with the Anunnaki. So you get reliefs of the Anunnaki with wings doing this ritual around whatever this device is or this technology that's kind of tree-like, but we're not really sure it is, or holding either a pine cone or a crystal and a bag. And you see this depiction with Anunnaki that have large beards, black hair, these wings quite stocky looking. And then you see the identical relief, only with an eagle's head. And that is not a coincidence. That is a cherubim, and probably one of many cherubim, but one choosing to use a human face, one choosing to use his eagle face, just as you have the true image of a sphinx-like or cherub-like image used to protect palaces and temples and the gateways to the other world. So it's a constant. They're just not as common as the serpentine look.
I can just mention that there's a very close link in Mesopotamia, in Canaan, and in Greece between serpents and the giant traditions about giants. And the giants are often, especially in Greek tradition, referred to as serpent seed or dragon seed. So that's quite interesting. I can just mention that on the sideline.
Especially when we consider Genesis 3:15 that uses that identical language as a cursed prophecy that I think is fulfilled with the creation of the giants, and the serpent's root that's talked about in Isaiah 14:25-29, that as you take the rest of the words back to the serpent's root, it's not going to say Nahash as the serpent. It's actually going to say seraph in a couple of the words there as that this ultimate root's going to produce. That's more of an end time prophecy at the end of that interesting prophecy. But yeah, it's important to understand that we get language biblically that talks about this seed line that is, again, in Psalms 21:8-10 is going to be addressed in the time of the end time, when that seed is going to be removed from the seed of humankind.
Ooh, we're getting into interesting waters here. But before we continue, let's move on to the second question here, because we can talk so long about this, as you guys realize. And there's a lot of questions that come up, even touching about this with the end times. But we'll get to that in other videos. The second question here, and I'm going to ask you, Dr. McLoud, did the fallen angels take human form, or could some have appeared as their true angelic selves while interacting with humans? Now, I think this question specifically, we know in the Bible that some angels appeared as humans as well, right? But let's answer this question in the way of those fathers of the Nephilim. Hey guys, I really hope you're enjoying the video so far, but I have some big and exciting news to share. I'm writing a novel with my brother set in the world before the flood. It's going to feel like a mix of fantasy and historical fiction. Much like Lord of the Rings, Warcraft, or Narnia. But here's the best part. It is based on biblical and archaeological truths. In this book, we're diving deep into the ancient world of fallen angels, the Nephilim, and the family lines of Adam, specifically Seth and Cain. You'll get to experience how they lived in cities like Nippur and Eridu, how they fell into darkness and how they became so evil in a world filled with beasts and dragons like the behemoth and Leviathan, described in the book of Job. If you've ever wondered what the world was like before the flood, in the antediluvian world, then this novel is going to bring it to life in a way you've never seen before. It's packed with action, spiritual battles, and deep insights into humanity's early struggles. It answers the biggest questions of humanity. Why are we here? What is the meaning of life? And where are we going when we die? And here's the exciting part. I'm giving you, all my amazing subscribers, exclusive access to the first 4 chapters of the novel for free. Just click the link in the video description, enter your name, email, and we'll send it to you. Now, if you're watching this video much later, this book might already be out. And then you can just grab it at any of our websites, at DLM Christian Lifestyle or Ruach Entertainment. Now, this book is perfect for unbelievers and even for those on the fence when it comes to their faith, because it's a gripping story that pulls you in, and before you know it, you will see how it aligns with the truth in God's Word, the Bible. Now, thank you for sticking with me. Let's get back to the message of today. Did the fallen angels take human form, or could some have appeared as their true angelic selves while interacting with humans? Now, I think this question specifically, we know in the Bible that some angels appeared as humans as well, right? But let's answer this question in the way of those fathers of the Nephilim.
Yeah, so in the Bible, we only read that the sons of God had intercourse with the daughters of men. So the Bible doesn't really tell us a lot. Often people assume that the angels took a physical form or something to have this intercourse. But I think the best example of a Nephilim in the ancient world, in accordance with this biblical text, which says that they were men of renown. The greatest man of renown in the ancient world was surely Gilgamesh. Now, in the book of Giants, Gilgamesh himself is mentioned as one of the Nephilim giants. Interesting about Gilgamesh is that his parentage is described to a Lilu daimon. A Lilu daimon, so that means a kind of spirit. But what is interesting in the Sumerian king list, where we find this reference, that it's at the same time says that this Lilu daimon was a high priest. Now, in other traditions about Gilgamesh and his parentage, with some literature, some very early texts that's going back to about 2500 BC, same time as the Caesium, that's the oldest literature that exists. In this case, we find that, and also later on in the Gilgamesh epic, we find that Lugalbanda and Ninsin is described as his parents. Now, there need not be a conflict between these two traditions, because it's quite possible that Lugalbanda was the high priest at that time of Kulab, which was in Uruk. It was probably in the time of, in the extra biblical tradition, he's called in Merkar, but he corresponds with the Nimrod of biblical tradition. It was probably during that period. And Lugalbanda then would have acted as a high priest. And then we can assume for this text to make sense is that he was possessed by some kind of daimon, this Lilu daimon. And when he had intercourse with Ninsin, from that was born Gilgamesh. And he is actually quite interesting, also described as a giant in the ancient literature as being 7 cubits, but we'll come back hopefully to that. Now, so all of this tells us that in the earliest traditions in Sumer, it was most likely understood that these gods or spiritual beings possessed the high priest during the sacred marriage ritual, the Heroes Games. And it was during this ritual that these Nephilim were fathered. We find the same idea later on in Babylon, where Herodotus actually mentions that the Babylonians of later times, that they actually set aside a maiden high up in the ziggurat with a god to have intercourse with her. So that's also something that we find. So in my opinion, this is the oldest layer of the tradition. But then later on, now we've talked about Sumerian traditions, the Babylonian traditions originated after Hammurabi conquered Mesopotamia in about 1818. He became the overlord in the high chronology of Mesopotamia. And then later on, we have a tradition about the same story, but in this case, we read the Babylonian tradition that it was an invisible man that fathered Gilgamesh. So what we find here is a recasting of that ancient tradition, and that it's understood as this invisible man appeared to this maiden high up in the ziggurat and fathered Gilgamesh with her. So this is also the kind of idea, I think, that we find in the biblical apocalyptic, or not the biblical, the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, the book of Enoch, and so forth. I mean, that's much like the traditions dating from about 400 BC, whereas the older traditions, the Sumerian traditions, as I've mentioned, go back to 2500 BC. So that shows how the tradition evolved. The Bible doesn't really tell us anything regarding this, any particulars, but I believe the best way to understand this is that in the ancient times, if you go back to the earliest of texts, is that these gods possessed the high priest during this ritual, sacred marriage ritual, and it was in that way, especially before the deluge, but also afterwards at the Tower of Babel. We'll come back to that in another talk, that the Nephilim was fathered, and one among them was Gilgamesh. So that's the way that I understand it.
Gary, do you want to respond to that or add something?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, one of the stumbling blocks for people, particularly from a Christian perspective, is how do spirit beings reproduce a physical trait?
Right.
And it's an important thing to be able to explain biblically for Christians if they're going to get right out on the sort of the complete preternatural edge of which the Bible is, but we kind of like to pick and choose what part of the preternatural aspects of the Bible we want to have. So it's an important topic. So a couple of things before I get into that from a biblical perspective, how that could come about, is that Gilgamesh is a very interesting character, and he's known in multiple cultures, right? But I think there might be more than one Gilgamesh. So I want to be careful in terms of the accounting. So as in the book of Enoch is more of a antediluvian or before the flood account. And people say, well, Gilgamesh would have survived into the post-Diluvian era, but that's not quite accurate because he is born after the flood, sixth generation, in fact, after the flood, as you go through the king's list, from Lugalbanda, the king of Uruk, as Willem was talking about, and the mother goddess Nin or Ninsen, depending on which translation that you're reading from, and she's a bull goddess, so almost like a cherubim or Ophanim aspect, right? Probably cherubim, but a bull goddess nonetheless. And so he's going to be 11 cubits tall and 4 cubits wide, and even in the same accounting in the Ugaritic text, which is absolutely amazing to have that accounting all the way into the Ugaritic text. So he's going to be 19 feet tall as king, 7 feet wide. So we're not talking about a small individual here. This is monstrous. And so what's interesting about that then is he seems to inherit perhaps the mythos of the Gilgamesh before, because when you talk about the cedar forest at Mount Hermon and King Hababa and all of the accounts that include the flood account, where he's going to meet the survivor, the Genesis Noah, and I know there's 1,000 different ways to pronounce it, so I'll use mine, Upnapishtim. And all of his family were giants as well, 2/3 God and 1/3 human. Just as Enkidu, who's also created after the flood as a counterpart to Gilgamesh, is 2/3 God, 1/3 human, which is, again, something a little bit different versus the demigod aspect, the offspring, physical offspring in the ancient world of a god or a goddess and a human male or female. And so all of this is sort of pointing towards some sort of physical sort of contact and a way of passing the DNA on. Now, King Lugobanda is either a human or a giant already. It's not clear. Lugobanda basically means a large man, right, as the king there. So it's probably a title for the kings, which they held most of the royal dynasties, both before and after the flood.
The name
So,
Lugobanda actually means little king, so he could have been a dwarf or a pygmy, perhaps.
I've got several references where
Yeah.
it's saying large, so I won't quibble over the translations. All I know is I have multiple sources on that I use, and I would also suggest that all the kings coming down and the Akkadians were also giants as you go through that whole lineage. So it makes sense that he's going to be a giant, and he produces a giant. So, and I'm fine if he's not a giant, because you still have the mother goddess or the angelic aspect that is the true definition, as we would understand that as a Christian point of view, in terms of how these giants are created. So important to understand offspring gods and parent gods when they reigned. It's as part of understanding the history and understanding that giants are named after the flood by giants that were before the flood. That's not uncommon. And that the mythos is passed on to the offspring gods that the parent gods had. So they take with all of that sort of history and legacy with them. And that these giant offspring were the divine representatives of their offspring or of their parents on the earth and took on their imagery. So all of that's part of the ritual sort of aspect. So giants are likely created within a ritual as well, just as you start the whole process with harem anathema, which is the oath and the oath-based system that's going to rule this world, which is the basis to carry the creation of the giants out that the 200 take on Mount Hermon to produce these giants seemingly before the flood, and or they survive the flood, or they're recreated again after the flood, because giants show up after the flood. I fall into the lean more towards second incursion, but leave the door open for others. So if it's a physical thing that is required to pass on their DNA, then are angels powerful enough to create DNA? Probably. But how are they able to pass on their counterfeit spirit? These spirits were originally immortal in all accounts all around the world. Biblically, they're limited, and we get that limitation to 120 years in Genesis 6:3, which is additional information to understanding a difference between giants after the flood that tend to show up. And so how would they do that? How would they pass on those physical traits? You can have an avatara effect, which is very common in polytheism. One of the best cases would be outside the Bible would be Vishnu, who was an avatar, I think 18 or 20 times. And Buddha would be one of his avatars, who he passed on the wisdom to create Buddhism. You have multiple accounts with Shiva doing the same thing. This is not unknown in polytheism. Biblically, we know this is possible because Satan enters into Judas to give him the courage to go through with the betrayal of Jesus.
All right.
So we know that that's possible. But does that allow you to produce and pass on a counterfeit spirit? Like, how does that transition through? So biblically, we can get there more easily to understand that they are spirit beings. And biblically, we can understand that they can take a physical form. How do we know this? Hebrews 13 tells us to be kind to strangers, lest we run across an angel unaware and we wouldn't
Mm,
even recognize them. So they can physically look like a human, not signal to them that they're uh, angelic of any sort. They touch, they feel. Genesis 18 and 19 in the visitation of Jehovah of the Elohim and the two angels are first are understood as men and not recognized as angels, but then Abraham realizes it. They're in physical form, they're eating, they're drinking, they're touching, they're doing everything sort of physical. And then those two
right.
angels go on to Sodom and Gomorrah, who interestingly want to have sex with them. Is it now the same sex ideology, or they want them to have sex either by changing into a female form to have sex with them, or do they want to have sex with their daughters to create more giants? Because they're ruled under Rephaim giants at that time, who were created by the Baalim after the flood, according to the Ugaritic text. And
Hmm.
so they know of this account, and yet they're recognized instantly as the judges. So they can choose to be recognized or not. So angels are described in different formats and in human forms in a lot of other accounts throughout the Bible. So we know they can take a physical form. So if you can take a physical form, you're going to need a dwelling place for your spirit. So where do I get that from? Well, originally these spirit angels, when they leave heaven in Jude 1:6, in the accounting of these crimes before the flood, they left their habitation. That's the Greek word oikaterion, which means a dwelling place, literally defined, a dwelling place for the spirit. So they left their dwelling place for a spirit that's in heaven, and now they're going to need a dwelling place for their spirit, which is the soul and the body of the physical world that the spirit merges with. And biblically, we're told you have a spirit, you have a soul, and you have a body. They are distinct, but the soul and the spirit merge to create the mind. So oikaterion is used one other time in the New Testament, and that is in 2 Corinthians 5:2. And that's in the description of this house in heaven, which we long for, even though we have our house in the earth. And this house in heaven is the Greek word oikaterion for a dwelling place for the spirit. So we have a dwelling place for the spirit that comes from God to us today in the soul and the body, but we long for our home and a dwelling place in heaven, just like the angels are, just like we're going to be resurrected to be like angels in the future time. So we now have a concept where how and why angels would take a physical form so that they could walk amongst us just as they're described all around the world, including the Bible, and that they could touch, they could have sex, they could drink, and they had this capability to do that. Now, if you create that body, you create the DNA, and somehow through putting their life force into that DNA that's theirs, they're going to pass on their traits and the counterfeit life spirit that we would know as the daemon spirit, which people would get from the KJV New Testament devil word that's used in the unclean and evil spirits that Jesus is depossessing people of. Possession is different than avatara. Demons are the disembodied spirits of the giants whose bodies died, their soul and body, but because their spirits don't come from heaven, they're forced to wander the earth in dry places, or if they follow their rituals according to their religion, they'll make their way to Hades or Sheol to be with their gods where they rule from. Or the worst case for them is to have their heads cut off. And either two things happen. One, it's by either way, it's still the worst way for them to die. Is they're either going to wander the earth or they're going to go to the pit prison where their celestial mafia godfathers went for the crimes that they committed. So when we look at this understanding of devils, that's the Greek word daemon. It's different than devil as in Satan, which is diablos. Different applications poorly translated as devils. So these are the disembodied spirits. And so these are the counterfeit spirits of the fallen angels. These are the ancient demigod spirits. So we have a way where they could pass on their traits. And now it explains why we get these monuments in a physical way to describe the physical nature of how angels show up on this earth, fallen angels, whether it's a multi-faced one using one face at a time, or it's a seraphim, or it's an archangel, perhaps, as a human face. And so that makes sense. And now we understand why we have the dragon kings, why we have the house of dragon, why we have all the serpentine imagery attached to the offspring of giants, offspring of seraphim, watchers. And by inference, if the bird faced cherubim had offspring, or the lion face, as in the lion men of Moab, they would look just like them.
Hmm. So I just have to say there's almost like 20, 25 videos that I can think of that I want to respond and talk about certain things. And I think the viewers are also, if you have questions, and add it in the video description. Sorry, in the comment section. And then, Willem, I'm going to give you just a few minutes to respond to this before we move on, because we have to move on here. But because a lot of people would ask, but doesn't the Bible say that angels cannot have offspring? The New Testament, because it says that humans will be like angels in heaven, right? But the thing
I
is,
will,
it
I will
says,
want to respond to that too, if we're going with that.
okay, I'll just make it very short, and then I'll pass it to Philip, and then back to you, Gary. But it doesn't say they can't; it says they don't, right? And so when they do overstep their boundaries, that's what we see happening in Genesis 6 verse 4, and probably maybe after the flood as well. But I just wanted to throw that out there and also say, hey, we can talk about all of these things, what could have been, and what the Bible says, to get to somewhere where we can learn more truth and understand. And we have to talk about these things in love. So even if you're in the comment section, talk about these things, but do so in love, right? Use your sources. Don't just say this is not true or that is not true. Back it up with some evidence. But all right, I'm going to go over to you. Willem, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I don't disagree with the idea that angels took physical form. It's right through the Bible that we find that. But it's true, as you mentioned, that Jesus does say that angels does not produce offspring, and this seemingly stand in conflict with what we read in chapter 6 in Genesis. So my view is just simple, as I've already mentioned, is that the angels, or the spiritual beings, the gods, which is just another name, a very old name for the gods in that early period, the only term used for the most part were the gods, and then these gods were spiritual beings. And as I've said in the Sumerian king list, the father of Gilgamesh is called the Lilu, the Hyman, a kind of spiritual being, because that same text says that he was a high priest. It suggests that this being actually possessed the high priest, and then it was during this sacred marriage ritual, which was extremely important in the ancient world, in the ancient Sumer. It was through that ritual that the Nephilim were fathered. This is just my view, and this is how I understand the ancient texts. I think we should be careful to project later traditions, which date from many thousands of years later, back onto, even though they talk about the early world, antediluvian world, or whatsoever, like the book of Enoch, etc. They are late texts. They may preserve some elements of ancient traditions, but they're not old texts. And we should be very careful, in my view, to think that these texts are actually a true representation of what really happened during that early period. They're not part of the Bible, and we should handle them and observe them in that way.
All right, I'm gonna give back to you, Gary, to respond to that.
Yep.
And I just
So,
want to
yeah,
say also
just
the next question is also going to go to you, because then you can maybe merge these two. The
sure.
next question will be: many have asked, how is it physically possible that human women gave birth to giants?
So I really like it's almost a discussion in itself. And so the short form, in terms of when people use "there's no marriage in heaven" to say that angels can't reproduce, They're usually referring to the Matthew account. And I would
Mm.
encourage Christians to overlay as well the Luke account so you get all the details.
Yeah.
And the Luke account is saying that we're going to be raised up to be like angels, and there's no need for marriage in heaven. And so just because they're not permitted to reproduce in heaven, and who knows, they may not be able to as spirit beings in heaven as well. It may be part of that spiritual aspect. We don't know, but it's one or the other. But they're certainly not permitted and not required to because they're already immortal. But Luke goes on to tell us that we're going to be raised up to be like angels after the resurrection, and we'll have no need for reproduction because we're going to be like angels in heaven. We're going to be immortal. So one wants to put all the details in the passages of the Bible together on these accounts, and it
Right.
makes sort of all of the haze kind of go away. Now, a constant in polytheist accounts around the world is how giants are created, and it's the offspring of a god, a goddess, a human male, or a human female. And so Hercules is the offspring of Zeus and Alcmene. There's no, people can infer, but that's an overlay, but it doesn't say they were spiritually involved. And just because they were high priests, even if they were used as an avatar, doesn't seem to be a requirement for those fallen angels to do it because they physically walked amongst us, right? So, and we get those accounts worldwide, and we get those accounts in the Bible. And, in the Ugaritic text, they're actually trying to bring Baal and the Baalim council back to reproduce more Rephaim giants in fertility rituals
Hmm.
because there's an issue with their reproductive capabilities after the flood. My inference there. And that they've inexplicably left. The wording is Baal died. Well, you can't kill an immortal. It's not possible, but you can send them to the pit prison for the same crimes, which are the violations against the laws of creation that the parent gods did. El produced giants before the flood. Baal and the Baalim produced giants after the flood. It's the same crimes and why they end up in the same sort of place. So now, when you have angels procreating physically with humans, you get into another interesting conundrum that you're talking about is how did they produce the babies if these were giant babies, right?
Yeah,
Or,
I think that's the question for most. How can that be possible?
yeah,
Small female humans and then these huge giants. Yeah.
coming out of them, as opposed, because
Mhm.
again, you could imagine a fallen angel taking whatever size they would want to be able to reproduce, or they could, uh, whereas giants might do after the flood. In the reliefs, you have them pouring semen into humans to create the hybrids, but it's how big was that baby as it got closer to the time of birth? So biblically, we don't get this in a direct account, but we get out of the Ethiopian version of the Kebra Nagast that the mothers were slaughtered in a ritual, in a cesarean type ritual, in favor of the unborn baby demigods versus the mothers. And so all the mothers died in childbirth. And they're called sirens in the book of Enoch, which is really kind of interesting because sirens are associated with mermaids and mother goddesses. So they're
Right.
like raised to a mother goddess level. And yet they're also created this sort of demonic sort of being for their crime in that account, that they're going to be associated with these mermaid type beings that are also called sirens in multiple
Hmm.
cultures. And I'm not saying they are. I'm just saying there's a Enochian accounting of the crime that they did, whether or not that's 100% accurate or not, but it has this interesting connection to polytheism, and that mermaids are also the enemy of humankind. They're not nice to humans. So there's a consistency to the mythos as well on that. So yeah, it was problematic, and that the wives met a horrible end, and they were considered inferior in favor of the demigods, who were going to have a body in their original form that was immortal. So you had an immortal spirit in an immortal body that was going to be a physical god that didn't have to transform in the physical world forever. And of course, that is the mismatch and the imbalance. That's the crime against creation that God is going to rectify through the flood, and also limit the physical body to 120 years thereafter, and not permit that to go on indefinitely.
Yeah, it lets me think about those wizards or shamans, and even stories like Lord of the Rings. They had these long beards, and if you grow to be 800 years old or 700, then you're a shaman or priest. You would look something like that, maybe with all that wisdom. But Willem, I'm gonna pause it to you. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I think in the first place, it depends on how large the Nephilim were. That's very important and a very difficult question to answer.
Right.
Gilgamesh, in the old Sumerian texts, we read that he was 7 cubits. We're not sure in what sense a cubit is to be understood here. And then also, clearly, this is a tradition. So it's not a historical narrative or something, it's just a tradition. But if it's a tradition, then from that text, we can say he was more or less, let's say, slightly or larger than 3 meters, which is quite interesting. In the Bible, we do not actually read how large the Nephilim were or the giants were. We know where in the Bible do we read how large they were. We do read that Och, the king of Bashan, in the land of the giants, named in this, the whole, quite interesting, and as such, we read that his bed was 9 cubits, but that doesn't really say something about himself. Maybe presumably he was smaller than that. And in the Greek tradition, we have something similar to the biblical Anakim. We have the Anaks, which is most likely referring to the same creatures or beings here. We read that was in Lycia, where they are attested, and Pausanias mentions that one of them was 10 cubits, which again is a very, very, that's a tradition going back more, say, 1,500 years until he wrote it down. So we cannot really take it that serious. So it's a very difficult question. It depends on how large the Nephilim had been.
Could I jump in on that?
Sure, you can jump in.
Yeah, see, if it was just one source that was pointing in a direction, but when you have the same consistency of the same dimensions in stories, you start to bend the mathematical plausibility of this being the same case, in terms of you can't trust it whatsoever. But when they're giving specific details, and believe me, I have multiple accounts, including the Ugaritic text, including Akkadian accounts, and a Sumerian translation that has 11 cubits for Gilgamesh.
That's not correct. The best authoritative text definitely says 7
I'm
cubits.
telling you, the translations I have say that, and they're consistent with the other translations, which I use as data points to say he's likely, 11 cubits tall. Now, when we look at what the Bible talks about Og's bed as being 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, it's also an iron bed to support his weight. And so this suggests something more might be going on. So he's the king of Edrei and Ashtaroth. So as Josephus talks about, you measure the giants on a royal cubit of 21 inches. So that's going to make him make his bed somewhere between 15 to 16 feet tall, just shy of 16 feet, and it's going to be 7 feet wide. He's going to fit into that bed. Typically, you're going to not make a bed that is going to be too small for yourself. So he's going to have to be able to fit in there. So what's the general sort of dimensions that we're getting that would sort of line up with this sort of size? And he's the last of the Rephaim after the flood in terms of the original Rephaim. So we have the 11 cubits with Gilgamesh, and then in another Greek account we have Orontes, which the river is named after, is also 11 cubits. So again, we have another sort of common number on the high side. The average size on the smaller side of a giant versus a hybrid giant is about 12 feet tall. So Achilles is about 12 feet tall, for example, and several other of the Greek giants are in that range. So Goliath is 6 cubits and a span, and it's king of Gath. And according to Josephus, then measure him on a royal cubit, that's 11 feet 3 inches. He's in that zone. He's stout, so he's going to be wide. So King Og is going to be somewhere between, say, 11 and 15 feet tall on the outside. So he's going to be, a fairly large giant. They kept the iron bed on display at Rabbah for the Israelites so that they wouldn't forget the monsters that they fought against. It was part of a museum. That's not done for somebody who is 6 feet tall or 7 feet tall. Just not done. And we get giants recorded throughout history. I mean, in that range as well, even in the time of the Roman Empire with Passio and Seclandia, they're about 11 feet tall. So it's not a one-off. And again, if we want to wash everything off to myth, then why use it at all? So we don't.
So I believe they were exceptionally large. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think, just in my way of thinking, I think the best way is to go with Gilgamesh, which is the archetype of the Nephilim, clearly, without any doubt. Renown, as the Bible says, it clearly says here in Genesis 6 that they were the men of renown, the best known of them being Gilgamesh, being 7 in the authoritative texts that I have used of scholars that's widely accepted. This text is not just any text. 7 cubits in that case is slightly more than 3 meters, which is still very large. I don't think it means they were small or just normal people. But I must admit that giantism is also something that's well known, and some scholars have actually proposed the possibility of a particular gene associated with giantism. And not too long ago, such a person, Rodolph Wadloff, he was nearly 3 meters. He was 8 feet 11. That's 2.72 meters. So the question as to how they were born, clearly he was brought into the world. And I think the Caesarean section is also something that was used, I think, in earlier times. Julius Caesar is said to give his name to this because he was a very large baby. But I think it might have been used much earlier, and it depends on how early that particular person was born, that baby. So I think that's a dispute that we won't be able to solve tonight, how large they were. Some would go with the most extreme numbers. In my opinion, we don't know. We just don't know. And I take Gilgamesh as the point of departure, and I think
and I'm open to the possibility that Gilgamesh might be, 7 or 8 feet tall, based on him inheriting the mythos of the antediluvian giant. So he could have been a smaller type of giant, right? Based on when Gilgamesh is born 6th generation after the flood. So there could be 2 individuals. So one wants to be careful with that. But what I found odd was, but again, if you're carrying the mythos what I found is other religions carried the same dimensions. But again, it could have been the original.
Yeah, 7 cubits. The original. Remember, 7 cubits. Yeah.
11. 11, 11, 11, 11, multiple
Yeah.
sources. So,
Okay.
and I've seen 7 too. I just looked for the consistencies of the data points, which is the one that I've used. But I'm open, and I think I talk about all the time that I think there's 2 different Gilgameshes, one
Hmm.
before the flood, one after the flood.
Yeah, I think
So
that's a discussion for another day. We will have to go in much detail. Yeah, which I
yeah,
don't is asked for at
yeah,
this stage.
and it is interesting to hear both these viewpoints and how you guys look at it. But the fact remains, when you're a baby, you can be big or small, but some of the women could die, and some of them, if you're a little bit smaller giant, you can still be brought forth. And I actually want to talk about the different types and sizes of giants, or let's say Nephilim, because maybe some of them. That's a question I'm going to ask soon. Maybe some of them are not like giants, very huge. So let's move on to the Nephilim while we are talking about this. All right. So number one, Willem, I'm going to ask you this. When I look at the depictions like the orcs from Warcraft or the Egyptian gods with glowing eyes and in Stargate, the series, I wonder, could
Yeah,
the Nephilim have resembled these beings, and what did the first family lines of Nephilim really look like? And I'd love you to
yeah,
respond to that, Gary, as well.
yeah. So the problem with the antediluvian period is we don't have a lot of information. Our earliest texts go back to 2500 BC. Now, I use the Septuagint dating for the deluge, which is about, let's say, 3000, between, let's say, 3100 and 3400 BC, around that time. And the reason is very simple, because 2400 that we find in the Masoretic texts in the generally accepted academic perspective of ancient history, that was the time of the Great Pyramids. There's no signs of a deluge during that period, but that's again for another day. So the problem is
Yeah,
that we have texts that's much later. Even if we, with the deluge taken as, let's say, 3400 BC, then it's still 1,000 years after the deluge that we have the earliest of texts. Now, it is true that they had a very good oral. The poets were able to really, in a very exact way, convey the oral tradition very accurately. We know that from some texts, for example, in Duana, the daughter of King Sargon the Great of Akkad, which in one of her 3 poems that she dedicated to the goddess Inanna, she actually mentions or call upon the poets to accurately convey the poem, and she used very technical terms there, showing that they had certain techniques, especially in that early period before writing. So we do have a
right.
very accurate and very old oral tradition. But the problem is, for the period before the deluge, we have very, very little data. We do have much later traditions, for example, the book of Enoch or so, but I don't take that really serious when I try to reconstruct what really happened in that early period. I would say the Edfu text is the closest that we have. And in this case, we read about, also it's actually a tradition that we also find in Sumer, is that the god Enki, that his seed fell on the ground, which is just a metaphor for the gods, for the fallen gods. And then from
Right.
his seed were, in the Edfu tradition was born a messianic figure, one with a shining face. And this is actually clearly stated to have happened before the deluge. This is quite interesting, because this face, this shining face, is something that we find later on in the post. Also in the antediluvian period, we mention is made of certain beings that's associated with the Sumerian word which means shining one. That's also the word from which Utu, the sun god of
The
ancient
sun god.
Sumer, his name was derived. So this terminology, this diamonds associated with this terminology, clearly, in my view, refers to the Nephilim, the shining ones. And there are actually 3 groups, different groups of them that's mentioned in ancient times, and some of them goes back to the time before the deluge, for example, the sages, 7 sages, but we do not read that they were giants. So I do not believe that all the Nephilim were giants. I only believe that some of them, certain ones, the builder gods, for example, that helped in Merkar or Nimrod with the building of his great project at Uruk, biblical Erech. They included in the terminology here in ancient Sumer is Gal. Gal. Gal means large or big, so the big shining ones. And then also among the warriors, we find these kind of Nephilim that were gigantic. But this is not generally true. Some of the Nephilim were definitely not giants. And we find, for example, also regarding Gilgamesh in the epic called Gilgamesh and Akka, where they have this great battle at the city of Uruk, that his face was shining brilliantly, with a kind of brilliance, exactly like this messianic child that we read of in the text that lived before the deluge. Now, Gilgamesh actually lived much later after the deluge, in my view, and according to the Sumerian king list. So we do read here, the word is Melam in Sumerian, Melamu in Akkadian. So it's shining, at this brilliant shining face. We also find it later on in Mesopotamian tradition and even in Persian tradition. So there's a very well-established tradition regarding the Nephilim being described in this way. So to say, in my opinion, not all the Nephilim were giants. We should just understand that that's extremely important. Some of them were not, and especially those regarding that were involved with the priestly kind of stuff and priestly order. It's a very ancient order, but there's a different way of that. It's not going to talk about that. And also some of the warriors, but some of them, some among them, were definitely gigantic according to tradition. But the problem is the antediluvian tradition. We do not have real good data from that period. We only have data from much later. So the best way, in my opinion, to try and understand the antediluvian period is from the post-diluvian period. And what we find and read about Gilgamesh, the archetype of the Nephilim, and the way that he is described, in my opinion, that's the safest way to also try and understand what happened before the deluge. And what Gary actually mentioned is quite interesting, because he belonged to the house of Uruk. And this house was said to have been descended from the sun god Utu. But this is most likely a later reworking of an earlier tradition, that they descended from this shining one, this messianic figure from the time before the deluge. It was in their midst that the sacred marriage ritual was also practiced to bring the gods from the time before the deluge back, and also later other gods, especially the Sabitu gods that were born in their midst, to enable them to take physical form and be born as the Nephilim. So I think that, in my opinion, the best way to understand the antediluvian period is from the post-diluvian period. And I think especially also because of the kind of continuation that we find between this concept of the shining one going back to the pre-diluvian and post, and sort of continuing in the post-diluvian and very early, clearly in the Uruk period. Now the Uruk period goes back to the period directly after the deluge, from about 3,400, I would say, to about 2,900 BC, and Gilgamesh lived slightly later. He lived in the Yemnet Nasser period. According to tradition, he was the one that built the great walls of Uruk, of the great city of Uruk, which was previously already, the city was built by Enmerkar, which agrees with Nimrod. He was from the same dynasty, but he lived after the Uruk period. So that's more or less my picture of history.
Yeah. Gary, anything you'd like to add there?
Oh, for sure. And so it is very accurate to say we have stingy information from before the flood. And we have the confusion of how history is passed down through the religions and through the offspring gods after the flood. but we do get some references, and we do have reliefs. Now, depending on whether or not you're going to date antediluvian, post-diluvian at, say, circa 2350, circa 2950 to 3050, or older, what's going to be antediluvian and post-diluvian. So consistency of data points is as important as you're trying to figure some of that out. But on a generic sort of basis, a lot of people will point to various translations of the first book of Enoch and look at a very interesting passage that is in the book of Enoch in the Aramaic translation, where it says the giants before the flood were 300 cubits tall. Well, it's not clear the cubit was used that far back, but if it was, that would make them minimum 450 feet on a common and even taller on a royal cubit, which seems a little bit unlikely, a little bit out of the realm, or a lot out of the realm, depending on what you would want to sort of view on that. The Giaz version, which is the Ethiopian version, has it as a unit called an L, 300 Ls. And we don't know what that unit is, and it's so old it's not defined. But
Right.
I think we might look at it that cubit was an Aramaic accounting of what an L might have been for that period of time, or they were absolutely monstrous. My view is the giants before the flood were larger than the ones after the flood, but not in this monstrous range. So, and if you use Gilgamesh as an antediluvian 11 cubit size, that's just over 19 feet. I generally say 20 to 40 feet tall would be the farthest I could get to in my research to stretch your neck out on how big these giants were after the flood. Before the flood. And so we want to be careful of that. And yes, we should look at the giants that show up after the flood as another reference, but perhaps as a different kind of giant, and maybe a second incursion giant, which to me reconciles more of the data points from a Christian perspective, as well as outside the Bible. Because we get accounts of second incursion in Sumerian with the Gilgamesh epic. We get that account with the Hesiod and other works where you have giants that were killed out in the wars, and then the second race of giants that come after, and you have accounts of both parent gods creating giants and then offspring gods creating giants, like with Hercules that we talked about earlier. So I think there is a different nature to these giants than the ones before the flood. I think they're smaller. I think they have less power. I think there's more restrictions put on with the edict that comes down in Genesis 6. And what's interesting, and what was mentioned earlier in the show, is that Nephilim doesn't show up a lot in the Bible. It shows up 3 times. Once in 6:4 and twice in Numbers 13:33 in the embellished part of the report. Doesn't mean that the Anak, which are the children of the Nephilim, aren't giants. It's just there may not necessarily be Nephilim giants. And that what it is saying, though, is that with a reference to antediluvian giants, they're trying to terrorize the rest of the Israelites not to go into the covenant land. And it's testifying that these giants that they're talking about to scare the Israelites are the same ones that were before the flood, which were bigger, meaner, more powerful, whatever you want to infer into what they're using for the scare tactic. How do we know that the Anakim aren't Nephilim? Well, they're used in different ways in the Old Testament. So Anakim are described in Deuteronomy 2 as giants, but not from the Hebrew word Nephil and Nephilim for plural. Just as the Horim, just as the Avim, as the Kajalhim, as the Amin, as the Zamzuzim are also described as giants in that passage. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word Rapha for giant is used 25 times, and even used as a tribe of giants in Genesis 14 as Rephaim in Genesis 15, which is interesting because Genesis 14 is the war of giants, the giants coming out of Sumeria, the 4 kings fighting against the 5 kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and their Pentapolis. But the first war they're going to fight is the Rephaim at Mount Hermon. We won't go into all the details as to why, but there's a reason for that. And so Rapha, when it says the valley of giants or the valley of the Rephaim, that's the word giant. When you're seeing Og as a giant and the remnant of the giants, that's Rapha, again, plural Rephaim. Only one other time in the Old Testament do we see the word giant that is derived not either from Rapha or from Nephil, but actually now from Gebur in Joshua or Job 16. And you can infer whether or not you think that's an accurate translation or not, because Gebur is used like 155 times in the Old Testament, but not every time for a giant. It can mean just a mighty one. It can also mean a noble. It can also mean just a man. So you have to watch the application, a strong man. And so, but it is used to describe the Nephilim as the mighty ones in Genesis 6:4. And the men of renown, or Shem, of fame or infamy, and Shemaim, equally it derives from meaning heavenly ones, or the stars, or the gods in heaven. So when we look at what's going on after the flood, there seems to be a distinction in the giants. And so we want to understand that they may not be as large. And by accounts, we can't get to what people would speculate the giants were before the flood, even though you have reliefs, depending on what dating you want to use for the flood, where these giants would be much larger than the giants that are depicted after the flood by the scale. And you can even get reliefs that will have 3 different groups of sizing of beings there. So one might infer one might be the gods. One might infer those are the offspring, and the other ones might infer those are the humans. Or hybrids. I mean, whichever group you want to throw in there. So, what else did they look like? Well, we talked about that description of Akhenaten and that sort of seraph type of look, but they're also a description of this 2-to-1 height to width ratio that was used to remind the Israelites of with Og's bed. So now, if we look at the descriptions of giants in the flood, you get this word stout that's used all of the time. Yeah. These weren't just tall individuals. These were powerful, perfect warriors. And 2-to-1 was the average for the width to height ratio. Now, the Gilgamesh one throws that one a little bit out of whack, because 11 cubits and 4 cubits in the sources that I use isn't a 2-to-1, but there's also a difference in the designation from demigod 50-50 to 2/3 god and 1/3 human. So there might be something else going on there. We don't know, but the dimension isn't quite the same. But what we do know is these just weren't tall, skinny beings. These were muscular beings. And so their eyes would shine. It would light up a room. That's constant, whether or not it's in the Tuatha De Danann, as they migrate up the Danube, as they go over to England and Ireland and Scotland. This is a constant around the world for the giants, that they were shining ones, with this serpentine look as the most common sort of feature. And so you have this tremendous size, and you have probably a longer neck as well that went with them. And so when you look at the word Anak, one of the definitions for Anak is a long neck. And also with Og, you get to as one of the meanings as well. So that suggests maybe a longer but thicker neck, not a pencil neck type of description, because these weren't built that way. So now when you see the serpentine imagery that you have coming out of Egypt with that cobra type of imagery for the headdress that would wrap around that neck, that might be as their bloodlines get diluted over time, that would be more of a representative of how they would have originally sort of looked, with that seraphim DNA being passed on to them. And the royales today, whether people want to believe it or not, keep their genealogies that go back to these giants and these royal dynasties, for them both before and after the flood. Whether or not that's 100% true or not, they believe it,
Yeah.
and it's what they do with that belief system is important. And it's that
Right.
word gene and genealogy that is very important to them, because they believe they carry the gene of the
Hmm.
original Rephaim and Nephilim patriarchs and the original gene of the gods that was passed
Right.
on physically to them as a physical offspring. And then when you match that up with the bloodlines, the serpent seed bloodline that we're facing within the Bible that's talked about, your data points start to produce a pattern. And that we need to be aware that even though there's some changes with these giants after the flood, and there seems to be a fertility issue with them after the flood, where the giants before the flood, from the limited accounts we had, could produce without any sort of issues. But after the flood, they seem to have this fertility issue. And one of the terms that's used for giants in the Bible is terrible ones, a
Yeah.
ret and a retim in the plural. And within that definition in Hebrew is this fertility issue. And one of the other common denominators that we look at within the royals and their belief system and their ancient rituals and things is that they want to keep intermarriage within a bloodline, and that they would use a pure blood matriarch to start a new dynasty. And it seems that they had issues producing females, which is their fertility issue after the flood. So if you do not intermarry with humans after the flood as a race, you're going to go extinct. And so they have to, but they're going to do it in a limited way, and they're going to follow these genses with that divine right to rule that we talked about earlier in their dynastic reign. And so you would have like the Creta of that goes back to Zeus as one of those bloodlines. The Julia gens that goes back in to the Romans and the Etruscans with Romulus and Remus going back to Mars and Ares. You have the Elbe gens, which is more used for more of the Tuatha De Danann, all part of the same groups of giants, Indo-Aryan groups, 4 to 5, depending on which historian that you're talking about, both before and after the flood. And so they keep these genses, and there's all these other genses around the world that they track. That is part of tracking their bloodline and their purity and the ennobling of those genes where they're going to fit into that hierarchy. So they've lost over time with this intermarriage size and features and powers, because they have to continue to replenish and marry outside, 4 generations is their typical restrictions within the royal families, lest they get blood diseases like hemophiliac disease or Habsburg jaw disease, which is a very appropriate one for a royale. And so I think we should look at giants from a post-Diluvian reference as having a partial image of the antediluvian ones, but a lesser state of being, giants nonetheless. And that when they originally started to reproduce with humans, they created hybrid races. So, for example, you have people like the 9 Canaanite races that are talked about in the Canaanite accounting of their 12 sons and clans, and that 9 of them don't have a patriarch. It's because Rephaim patriarchs don't show up in the table of nations in Genesis 10 or First Chronicles. But
Yeah.
we do have Genesis 36 that's going to show, in addition to the table of nations, some genealogies which we need to know to understand the Old Testament. And so you're going to have the Horim Rephaim giants that we talked about from Deuteronomy 2, whose daughters are going to intermarry with Esau and Eliphaz to produce hybrid races like the Amalekites, and with a pureblood female to start a new dynasty. So Timnah is the daughter of Seir, and Oholibamah is also a purebred female giant intermarrying with Esau to start another likely Horites as they show up versus Horim, as it would be sort of understood from that hybrid giant, and that these 9 Canaanite families are hybrids as well. Now, in the Egyptian execration texts, these individuals that lived amongst the Anak or the Anakim were people like the Amorites that don't have
Yeah.
a patriarch, which would be likely rooted back, and I trace this in book 2, to Amor, who had offspring also named Amor of the Baalim gods. So there's an understanding that we have to have a look as this progression of the giants in the first creation before the flood, and then what we see after the flood, what we see down through history. And even up to the time of Josephus, they kept these bones on record, according to Josephus.
Right.
And here's what he said. And again, you can throw away every accounting that people don't want, but it has the consistency of the data points as well. And he actually talks about giants as being the same groups of people that are talked about in the Bible, as a common understanding in all cultures around the time in his time. So here's what he said. He says, for which reason they removed their camp to Hebron, home of the Anakim that are talked about in Numbers 13 that we're talking about, with the 3 Anakim kings. There till then left the race of giants whose bodies so large and countenance so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike any credible relations to other men. They are on museums to remind the Israelites of the people that were fought in the time of the Exodus. And if the giants were larger from before the flood, we don't know how big they were, but they were certainly larger than the ones after the flood, if that was indeed the case. And seemingly the accounts suggest that they were larger. We just don't know exactly how much larger.
Yeah. Brings up a lot of questions. I think a lot of people, I'll just throw this in there very, very, very quickly. We can answer this and then we can move on. But talking about the bones, it's a lot of people who ask, well, why aren't there a lot of Nephilim bones today that we can see? Giants.
Long ago, after the rise of a deep darkness, before the great flood, the world was ancient, untamed, and filled with wonders long forgotten. Mankind spread into scattered tribes, forging cities like Nippur, Eridu, and many watchful outposts across the untamed earth. The sons of God breached the divide. The world bowed to their corruption. The blood of Seth and Cain shaped the fate of generations amidst the roar of the behemoth and terror of the Leviathan. And under the oppressive shadow of the fallen Anunnaki, humanity stood on the precipice of total corruption. In a world ravaged by darkness, one man, born a slave, rises as a warrior, driven by his search for truth and meaning. But his journey is more than survival. It reflects the cry of humanity itself. and leads to an ancient prophecy. From the darkened halls of Eridu to the Temple of Light in Nippur, Uldako walks a path of survival, of bonds broken and kept, pursued by beasts, shaped by love, scorched by loss, and caught in the war behind all wars. The war between the Sons of Light and the Lords of Shadow. One brought forth from the blood of the dragon, the other born from the light. The war between them has already begun. Lightborn, Dawn of Darkness, a new novel from Ruach Entertainment. Get the first chapters free at ruachentertainment.com.
It's a lot of people who ask, well, why aren't there a lot of Nephilim bones today that we can see of giants?
Yeah, so obviously in the ancient world, we find that the giants, they mentioned, and there was even, as Gary has just mentioned, certain brothers, for example, Goliath and these two brothers are also mentioned as clearly as gigantic figures or giants. It's also clear that they were not that numerous in my way of thinking and understanding things. They were particular to certain families. And so it's not strange that we have not found these kind of bones. I think if you take the percentage of bones from the ancient world that we have found, it's much less than 1%. I mean, it's not even 0.1% of the bones. So it's not that strange to me. For example, just giantism that I've already mentioned, we have figures that's quite large. I've mentioned the person that is about nearly 3 meters. So obviously, it existed in the ancient world. That's gigantic figures. They existed. Caesar, for example, was quite large according to tradition. But finding these things in history is not that easy. It's just history is not, sometimes people would say, if you can't show it to me empirically, then it's not true. But history is not like that. We once we understand archaeology and the limits of archaeology, we also understand why things are often not found and take a long time. For example, there was a long time when skeptical scholars did not believe that the King David existed. And then the Tel Dan Stela was discovered.
Yeah.
So it's a real problem that we do read about things. And the reason why I do believe that the biblical narrative is not to be taken in isolation. We also read about these figures outside the Bible in Canaanite sources, in Greek sources, in Mesopotamian sources. And for example, I've mentioned Gilgamesh. So, and especially regarding the Hurrians, there's a very close association between the Hurrians and the giants, and that goes back to the Akkadian period, when the Hurrians enters history for the first time in literature. Yeah. And there's very close to Ugalu, for example, derived from Ugal that I've mentioned earlier, the large or big shining ones. They were typically associated with the Hurrians. So they existed, there's no doubt in my mind, but that we don't find them, that's also not strange to me.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Just before I give it to Gary, I just want to mention there's a few people who commented that even those bones that they showed to Israel was probably dinosaur bones, so people say these kind of things as well. Gary, what would you say?
Well, they kept the bones from the people they killed, so in the wars. So maybe they killed dinosaurs then. I don't know. I can't make a case that dinosaurs were there at that time. But yeah, so I get it. It's tough to first get your head around the idea of giants. So let's go forward to more recent times as to how we see things handled with these giant skeletons, and particularly in North America.
Yeah.
So from about 1850 to about 1950, you had this significant number of discoveries of giant bones, elongated skulls that were larger than humans, that were sutureless. And you can't create more volume by binding a baby skull at childbirth. You can make it elongated, but you can't increase the volume capacity. These are way larger than humans, but there's records of this that were recorded in newspapers. And so I have a link that I can send people.
Yeah.
I'll send it to
Yeah.
you after the show. And it's a spreadsheet that has many of these accountings of these newspaper stories. And it gives you, so on the spreadsheet, it gives you some of the dimensions. Some are as small as 7 feet. Some of them are as high as 18 feet. There's even a few in there that are 30 feet that are maybe not from the US, but from Mexico, which may be a little bit less reliable. I don't know. I don't want to sound prejudiced on that, but that's sort of out of the norm. So that's why I say, but I want people to know what that range is. Now, what's interesting with this spreadsheet, as you click to the right, you're going to have a column where you can click on to go directly to the original newspaper story where it was discovered. Now, there's two commonalities to what happens to these bones. Is they get discovered. They call the local university. The local university takes all of these notes and decides this is a spectacular sort of discovery. What are we going to do? We'll get a hold of the Smithsonian. Smithsonian comes along, collects all the data, collects all the bones. They get sent there, never heard of again. The second thing that happens is the people who find the bones, they contact the Smithsonian directly. Same thing happens.
Yeah.
So it's not that there isn't a record of this. Now you can say that all of these disparate newspapers around the United States and editors and writers and different dates are in some sort of cabal conspiracy to do this, but I don't know whether that really tests any proper scrutiny. But people can rationalize anything by themselves. So the Royal Society.
Remember that people also embellish. That's also true.
But these are specific sizes with measurements that they're posting. So again, could they do that? I suppose, but now you're really creating more fiction on information that's not there. And I know we have a lot of fake news today. I can't imagine. I've never read anything about a conspiracy when I was growing up of how people would exaggerate sizes of discoveries of archaeology, but only with humans, because now you could do it with dinosaurs, but you can't do it anyways. The logics just sort of stretched on that. The Royal Society is the parent organization to the Smithsonian, started by a Royal Society and Rosicrucians, James Smithson with his dowry.
I did not know that.
People don't know that. And sponsored by all Masonic organizations to bring this come about, including Masonic presidents, all because they're part of the same kinds of organizations in the background. And the Royal Society and the Vatican are sort of, and I would say Smithsonian is a vassal of the Royal Society. So let's get it down to two major groups. Royal Society and the Vatican have been collecting artifacts ever since their creation, and they have the largest storehouses of things and do not give a full accounting. Will recognize they have a lot of ancient objects, but won't give a full reckoning of what they have. So for some reason, they don't want to show these things. You would have elongated skulls and bones all throughout the Mediterranean islands shown in museums up to about 40 or 50 years ago. They still have them in the back rooms. They just won't bring them out. So you have reliefs and artistic portrayals throughout the ancient world of giants. You have accounts all throughout the ancient world, and you get a consistency that there was this race that enslaved humans.
Hmm.
And they ruled the top two classes and still do to this day for the most part. And I think if we look at information control, that seems to be one of the MOs of the elite, to control the information. And
Yeah.
people can view that any way that they want. But how do you look at this whole volume and they just say it doesn't exist? And so giants in the Bible, there's a lot more there than most people think. And it's not
Yeah.
just individual families.
Yeah.
You have the tribe of the Rephaim that I talked about. You have the tribe of the Anakim. You have the tribe of the Hivim. Hurrian would be Hurim and part of the Horim. You have Hivim, Hurim, and Horim as you take it back to their patriarchs as a division of one group of giants that came down from the mountains and down into the covenant land. So three distinctions amongst that group: Perazim, Amalekim, Zuzim, Zamzuzim, Emim, Gerzim, Gesherim, Makathim, Avim, Cherithim, Pelathim. I could go on. There's more. They're not recognized or taught as giants. And you'll have Eastern giants that are talked about in the Bible, like the Cadmonim, which is Ben Kadim, BNQDM, for the giants that are talked about in the Ugaritic text from the East. And you have the Olamim, which Elam accepts the name of and merges with this group of people from the Shemites after the flood, which again are the ancient giants of the East as you take that back in its meaning. So my only point is you have all of that, then you have all of the hybrids that are 7 to 9 feet tall. And it's important to keep the details consistent and straight when we're talking about the different kinds of people. And I get it. I'd love to diminish the giants away. In fact, I refuse to research it for a couple of decades for the most part, because I didn't want to deal with it. I get it. But I just can't ignore this amount of biblical information and outside biblical information.
Yeah, it's so clear. It is in the Bible. It's in all cultures. We do know that there were giants, the Nephilim. But Willem, you wanted to respond to that, and then we'll move to the last question.
Yeah, I just want to mention something regarding the Rephaim. Now, in the Bible, the word is used for giants and also linked with the Nephilim in that sense. But it's also used for diamonds, for spirits, certain kind of spirits. Dead spirits is just the dead, often translated. And it clearly refers to these diamonds associated with the Rephaim. Now, the word Rephaim is actually quite interesting because the Rephaim had, for a long time, the word Rephaim only appeared in the biblical texts and in Phoenician tradition. Much later, the Phoenician tradition is not that old. But then with the Ugaritic texts, I discovered what the Rephaim is also mentioned in these texts, and today we call the text in which they are mentioned the Rephaim texts. There are a lot of dispute among scholars regarding these texts, and the difficulty is to understand where the word originates. I personally think it comes from the Akkadian word Rabaum, meaning to be large, great. It's also the origin of the Amorite title Rabum, meaning a chief or a leader. So the word means something like hail or vigorous ones or heroes, quite similar to the way that the Nephilim is understood in the Bible. But what is important is that the Rephaim was obviously not all of them giants. We have certain texts that are sort of was transcribed or written by scribes, and that was associated with the cult of the dead. And when the kings of Ugarit, when they died, the ancestors are mentioned, and the Rephaim as part of the ancestors are mentioned. So it's important to note that all the Rephaim were definitely not giants. Again, in the same way as I've already mentioned regarding the Nephilim, it was only some among the Rephaim. There was just one. I've talked about the three groups among the Nephilim. We find the very same three groups among the Rephaim. And the word Rephaim actually refers to these diamonds. These, which I would, as I personally see them as absolutely equivalent to the Nephilim diamonds. And because there are three different groupings, only some among them were giants, and these were the ones that the biblical Israelites encountered. So I just want to mention that as a little bit of background regarding
let's add to that background then. So in the Hebrew, you have 7495 in the concordance, which is Rapha, meaning to heal. It's the source word. 7496 is the demonic spirit that you're referencing to, and it also can be translated as dead or death, that is, it's used from a biblical perspective. 7497 is the word giant, and then you've got Rapha 2 or 3 times after that, which are specific names of patriarchs of the house of Rapha, Beth Rapha. So when we now overlay that onto the Ugaritic text, we get the original Semitic RPM. The H is added as Hebrew evolution comes along, as the vowels are. It would be as Nephilim would be the ancient NPL. So RPM, we see that translated in some of the Ugaritic texts as Rapiu or Rapiyum, but still the same word as you take that back to the original Semitic for both languages. Typically, the Ugaritic text will use the word healer for its preference of the translation for these offspring of Baal, of Anat, of Amor, of Karet, of all of these Baalim gods that are creating giants from the council. They had healing capability in the Ugaritic texts. They could heal themselves and they could heal others. It's not explained how they had that ability, whether it's technology or part of the DNA. A lot of people speculate, and I think it makes a lot of sense on the speculation. That's why you're going to take their heads, so they couldn't repair themselves, because they had the ability to grow back their own arms and things. So you had to kill them in a way that they didn't have time to repair. That's why you take the head of a giant. And a tradition that comes out of history and we'll see resurface in the end time. My speculation, but in book 2, I give you a lot of data points on it, if people want to go deeper on it. And that these were individuals that when they died, so these ones can die versus the ones before the flood who were immortal, they would be paraded to Hades or Sheol by other Rephaim kings, so they could go interdimensionally. And so that's the spirit aspect of the giant. And then the physical aspect. So all three are pertinent, as we understand, as the source word transfers some of the meaning, as I mentioned with Nephal and Nephilim earlier. Some of that meaning is moved forward to the derivative word, but it also has its own distinct meaning as a giant or a demonic spirit. But they all reflect what is being talked about with the giants. So we want to be able to look at it in a manner where what are these beings talked about in the Ugaritic text? Is it similar to what's being talked about in the Bible? Absolutely. And were these the kings? Absolutely. Did they have a council? Absolutely. It was the council of the Datanu. And some people make an argument that the D and the T interchange, then you drop the U, the suffix on that, and you get the council of the Titans. And yes, you can do D and T transliterations between the languages as the same sound. We see that in Hebrew in that same sort of understanding as the Dan versus the T in there for the second D. So, and they report to the council of the gods who receive that divine right to rule. And so I think that when we look at these accounts and we see the same stories in the city of Ug-Arit, the city of Og the Terrible One, again, you have Kiriath Ug-Arit, as you would take that forward out of the Greek. And I think after, my speculation here, I think after the War of Giants in Genesis 14, when the Rephaim are mostly wiped out as a specific tribe, he actually moves to Bashan region and takes over as king of Bashan with his 60 cities and rules from Edrei and Ashtaroth after most of his brethren were wiped out in that war. And Amorites are going to be the hybrids underneath them that he's going to rule over for the most part. Doesn't mean there aren't other giants there, but I think that's how Og ends up in the time of the Exodus, when Israel goes to go around Edom on the east side of the Jordan and don't get free passage, and will have to war with Sihon and Og and the Midianites before crossing into the covenant land. So I would not say that these are limited, and I wouldn't confuse the application of spirit with giant or healer. And when I look biblically, I look at the application for the translation for that, and it makes sense in those applications on how they've translated that. So for the most part, I have no issues in terms of how they designate those three meanings. I think we should take that as also guidance to apply to aspects of the whole giant understanding.
A lot to think about. Just so you guys know as well, right? We keep to the Bible, but it is interesting to look at what is possible and what these things mean. And so I guess you guys will have a lot of questions. So add it in the comment section down below. But also get their books, because their books, when you read it, they explain a lot more, and it'll be interesting to see what is described in there. But I want to slowly move to the last one. I know it's late as well, Dr. McLeod, for you there in South Africa. I can see it's dark there. And Gary, thank you so much as well. I mean, you're still battling there with the flu. But let's get into it. So the last one that I just want to ask here is that someone asked, these beings where you look at fantasy movies these days, right? But when you look at history from the Greeks, you see these things in it. So when we look at trolls and gnomes and fairies, dwarfs, centaurs, these things, this person is asking, while we know pre-flood Nephilim were massive giants, could there have been smaller Nephilim that look strange, like smaller shamanistic beings, pygmies, mythical beings that we hear about, like these fairies and dwarves and centaurs and gnomes, these kind of weird beings?
Yeah, so it's interesting that Tolkien actually talk about the Urukai. So the fact that he makes reference of Uruk in that sense is quite interesting, because this is where this great ancestral family of the Nephilim ruled long ago in the time after the deluge.
I just want to add very quick, for those of you who do not know who Tolkien is, he wrote the story of the Lord of the Rings, right? Sorry.
So he also has this idea, or he describes them as being born from the earth,
right?
From the mud and so forth. Now, this is also quite interesting, because this is actually a Greek idea. In that tradition, the giants, or the dragon seed, as they were also called earthborn. They were regarded as being born from the earth. And what is also interesting about this is it was closely linked to the sacred marriage ritual that we find in the Dionysius rituals. And it was actually just the sacred marriage ritual of ancient Mesopotamia. It just continued to exist later on in the form of Osiris rituals in Egypt, Dionysius rituals in the Mediterranean world, etc. So it's the same kind of rituals. It goes back to the earliest of times. We find it, for example, closely linked to the Demeter type of cult, etc. But what is quite interesting here is that they were regarded as earthborn. And it seems to me that the idea behind that was it was the spirits that of the dead, in the way that we've just discussed, the Rephaim, that was to be reborn. It's these diamonds, these ancient spirits of the Nephilim that was to be reborn through the holy sacred marriage in some of these persons fathered through the sacred marriage. And this is actually the very same idea that we find in ancient Sumer and ancient Mesopotamia and later on. Because it's a continuous tradition, we do find it again in Greece. So this is quite interesting, but I think we should always understand that there's a difference between history and legend and myth. So, for example, let me give an example. Historically, there was the great battles of the great king Naram-Sin, the Akkadian ruler, he lived in about 2200 BC. He battled these forces, the Hurrians especially, and among them counted these, I've already mentioned them, the Ugalu.
Yeah.
So we have these gigantic beings in historical context mentioned in the Akkadian period already, and also depicted in a very strange form as kind of spirits on the seals. And then later on, we find exactly the same. So although in the Akkadian period this happened, they originated a legion, the legions of the Akkadian emperors spread all over the world, especially Naram-Sin, and how he battled this dragon monster. So there was this evolution where these opponents were now depicted and portrayed as dragons, that he fought. And the Hurrians actually self-identified with this image, seeing themselves as the dragon's seed. And then we have some myths that developed, for example, the Azach kind of demon, that's a rock giant. And this is a myth. He has three heads, 3 arms, etc. So we have lost the relation with history. But we still have some kind of vague remembrance of these ancient traditions. So we should also always understand that this is a difference that we should make. And when we get to Tolkien, what he's actually doing here is create fiction, but what he's also doing is, in a certain sense, writing a certain mythos, which he built upon earlier mythos that we find especially in Europe, but also, as I've mentioned, in Greece and etc., and which, as I've already mentioned, in my view, goes back, some of it, but especially regarding the Nephilim, obviously, to giants in history. So I think we should be careful not to read too much into the mythos and the myths associated with the Nephilim from the ancient times. And obviously, when it's fiction, it's fiction.
Yeah.
But it's still very much something to enjoy. But I think that gives a wrong perspective because it creates the idea that this is what the Nephilim and the Nephilim bloodlines are like. Whereas it's not in our current dispensation, in our era, it's not like that. Those that are descendants of these ancient lines, and in my 3 volumes, I trace them throughout history. They are not so easy to distinguish. They look like us. So this gives the wrong impression. It gives an impression that this is what we should look for. And I think that can be dangerous because that's removed from reality. And that's why we should make this distinction.
Well, it's very insightful. I think there are the people who talk about, some other sources that talk about how these fallen angels also, that there are things with beasts, with animals, and then we have these strange beasts coming forth and those kind of things. But Gary, maybe you want to talk a little bit and just regarding that, and then also just respond or add to what Willem said.
I think when we have writers like Tolkien and Lewis, they are very skillful in in a narrative that they write. And their style is mythopoetic. It's an ancient style that's been passed down. And they create a fiction or a fairy tale based on their belief system and their history and their genealogies. And so this is an allegorical sort of story of their belief systems and history, and you have to know the meanings to the allegories to understand the true story in their type of belief system. So what's interesting about the Lord of the Rings is it ends in the third show when you have all of these different creatures that are going away on a boat. And the imagery that Tolkien says that he was portraying was this is the time of the flood, because now it's going to be the time of humankind. So again, I'm not saying he's writing that as complete history, but there's truth in it. It's just a little bit more complex than some of the other accounts that come down because they keep adding to the sophistication of their genre. So what we get in there is a bunch of these little beings called elves and fairies, right? And we get this interesting noble elf, or this white elf as it's depicted. And white elf is a little bit different in the understanding of the elf mythology and mythos. And so the white elves are actually a depiction of the fairy folk, the Tuatha De Danann, which are giants in their understanding. I'm just talking about how they look at these. And then they have three different groups of these other little ones. And so you have mischievous ones in their belief system, like leprechauns and pixies, and there's a whole mix of them. You have ugly ones like trolls and dwarves, and you have good-looking ones like Tinkerbell and Peter Pan and things like that. But three sort of groups of these little ones. There's a fourth group, which is part of their religion as well. Understand, they take these elementals, as they talk about them, back to specific aspects of elements of this world, like earth, fire, wind. And so the fourth one is a little bit different. It's called salamander, the reptilian, and they're more like larger than humans in their belief system.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is about this is that Tolkien is overlaying a Norse elemental fairy allegory onto what's being talked about in that story versus the more Celtic version of Irish and Welsh and other ones around the world. What's also very interesting is, and it doesn't matter where you go in the world, when we talk about the little ones, you have the identical same three groups of people that are separated into those three separate groups within that polytheist religion. That's the same religion all around the world, which is inexplicably never accounted for, just different vernacular names for the gods. So as we look at that, whether it's First Nations in North America, which is more for the North American audience here, they have the same groupings that also associate them with giants and caves in their history. So all of a sudden now you have inexplicable accountings on every continent all around the world, except for Antarctica, of course, and who knows what will be found there down the road. But with the ones that we know about, this is standard history that's coming down that is inexplicably the same. And each of these groups were created by the gods in a Nephilim-like manner, but something distinct. And they're not as big, for an example. They don't seem, and in their hierarchy, the elementals are at the bottom of the visible hierarchy. But they're created in the same way, but something different is involved. So one would deduce, are they more human-like, or is there another DNA mix that's in there, whatever these gods are saying that they're doing on however they do it, and they either pass on counterfeit demonic spirits, or as Willem was talking about, they would have to be oikatarians or clone things that they create as a dwelling place for an existing demonic spirit, but then they wouldn't be at the bottom of the realm, because the disembodied spirits in the hierarchy are higher than any of the elementals in the polytheist belief system. So just going with the consistency, they seem to be Nephilim-like but different. So more human, less godlike is probably the connection I might make through speculation through 2/3 God, 1/3 human that the Sumerian accounts for the giants mix was versus 50-50 of the standard understanding from the Bible or Greek as two quick sort of examples. So do we have a biblical understanding for these people? Well, yes, we do. And something that we need to maybe dig a little deeper in and maybe try and figure out a little bit more. In the New Testament, we get the term elementals that is used, that comes from the Greek word stoichion. Elementals is translated into English for the basic elements of the world in certain passages, but in Colossians and Galatians, it's translated differently. In Colossians, it's rudiments, and in Galatians, it is elementals or elements of the world. And these are the forces that enslave us in this physical world that are being talked about. Inanimate objects don't enslave us. We also get one really weird passage in the Old Testament in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 26, if I remember correctly, of the Gamadim, which are in the towers of Tyre, fighting in the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Gamadim, I am plural, that's used there. And for a people and or ones, as you would understand that, just as seraphim would be serpent ones, giants would be Nephilim as in giant ones. As you take that I am majestic suffix that's in multiple languages as a dynastic bloodline, as it's used, getting back to the Gamadim, that's the Hebrew word gamad in its singular format, which means a cubit, which would be 18 inches as a standard cubit because they're not a king. But even if it was 21 inches, they're not very big. And these are, what would you call the little ones, right? The cubit ones or whatever you want to call them. That's their dimension that they're described after. So we get little people that are described as well and quite small. But it's those elementals in the New Testament that I focus on, and the understanding of the polytheists and the people of the royals who promote their four-class system that they imposed in their elite system with this religious polytheism that has this visible hierarchy that rules the world today, that reports the invisible ones of the Council of the Gods. So I wouldn't just dismiss this. I would say we want to maybe understand this a little bit more so that we can better understand how the polytheists see this world works under their guidance.
Interesting. We'll have to look at these things and see what the Bible says. And, I grew up in a Christian home, but I wasn't a Christian until my early 20s, right? And so my early years, I played some of these games like Warcraft and these things. So you can see this world, but from the lens of the traditional church, it's not really explained. And so when you start to ask these questions, a lot of people don't have answers. And so what we discuss here is so important that we go back to the Bible all the time to understand that that is the truth. That is what we have to base everything on. But it is interesting that once you know what the Bible says, to still look at certain options of what could have been. Even if we look at normal things like Peter, when he was called, he had a wife, right? What did she feel like when he had to go and share the gospel as a woman? The Bible doesn't say that, but we can try to imagine what could have happened there. Now, when we talk about these beings and there's this whole spiritual world that we as humans still do not fully understand. And even though some of it we can start to look at, and we can look at history, we can start to dive into this a little bit deeper, still, only in heaven we will be able to see things more clearly and be able to understand. Now it's dimly, like we're looking into a mirror, right? But I appreciate both of you for the time that you've given. I think we have to slowly move towards a close here, but there's one thing on my mind that I would love to make a second video about, and that is how when we look at history, because history connects with the end time prophecies, right? And Jesus says as well that the end times will be like the days of Noah and Lot. But we know the fallen angels came, they created the Nephilim, and then God stopped it all with a flood. But then the same thing started to happen after the flood as well. But then this time it wasn't just a flood, but something happened at the Tower of Babel. Now, the Bible doesn't go in a lot of detail, but there's a lot to talk about there with these Nephilim, the role that they played. When we look at the kings, and even that a lot of the people today, the secret societies, believe that they are descendant from these Nephilim, why this is important and why people need to make the connection. So maybe we can talk about that. What really happened at the Tower of Babel? Would that be something that you guys would like to talk about?
Tower of Babel is always a fun topic.
Fascinating.
Okay. Do you guys have any last words for the viewers before we go?
Yeah, and I think it probably leads into what we're going to talk about maybe on the next show, is that there's an interesting passage in the Old Testament that links into the days of Noah in the chronology that Jesus provides in the fig tree generation for the end time. And it's Ecclesiastes 1, where it says, "Nothing is new under the sun. What was will be again."
Right.
And the understanding of this, I'm paraphrasing as I move into about verse 17, is that the understanding of this will only bring grief and sorrow. But we need to understand that concept, that nothing is new under the sun. So if we want to understand what the end time is going to be like, we better go back and have another look.
Right. Sometimes it's hard for us to see because it's just packaged differently. And we need to be wise to be able to spot the similarities. Willem, anything that you want to add?
Yeah, so you've mentioned the end times. And I do think, for example, in the book of Revelation, that certain Nephilim motives are definitely present in that book. I discuss it in my third volume in some detail. But
Yeah.
it's something that's very relevant to our own time and in the times to come, I believe.
Yeah.
I do too.
This is going to be a very interesting discussion. Now, we talked a little bit about what the fallen angels looked like and also the Nephilim. But guys, there's one thing that the book of Revelation also specifically explains with John seeing this revelation, what those angels that Jesus bound up in the pit will look like when they are released. And so if you want to have a look at what those angels will look like in the time of the Great Tribulation, watch this video here. I'll see you there. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Willem. I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.